Hi, everyone. We'll just give it a few more seconds for people to join us. All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Welcome to the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at Stanford University. This is our next to last seminar of the winter quarter, which is maybe not a length of time that matters if you're not at Stanford, but we are very excited to have with us today Dr. Ken Apollo, who's an assistant professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. His research interests include the political economy of development, legislative politics, and electoral accountability in African states. He's the author of Legislative Development in Africa, Politics and Post-Colonial Legacies, published with Cambridge University Press in 2019. And he was a postdoctoral fellow here at CDDRL after receiving his PhD from Stanford University a few years ago. Today, he'll be discussing his new research on programmatic politics and elections in Tanzania. Again, if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll make sure to reserve a good chunk of time, like half hour, for questions and discussion with Ken. All right, Ken, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Didi, and the CDDRL community for inviting me back. It's great to be back, even if virtually. I think I've only been back twice before since graduating, and I look forward for a post-COVID reunion with everyone on the farm. So today I'm presenting some work that's co-authored with James Habyarimana and UD Shipper on the cyclical effects of a programmatic policy in Tanzania. And the motivation for this research is Tanzania specific, but also more broadly thinking about African states. So if you look at the trends in school enrollment in African countries, there's sort of this stylized pattern of a rapid increase after independence, a bit of a stall or a huge stall during the economic crisis of the 1980s, and then a more recent rapid increase with the Millennium Development Goals and the widespread adoption of universal primary education in many African countries and around the world as part of the MDG agenda. Now, following that, there has been sort of a lag in increase in enrollment in secondary education. So as you can see here, the increases in secondary enrollment seem to lag a little bit the increases in primary school enrollment. And even in the secondary school enrollment, there has been a market increase, albeit at a lower level, since the early 2000s in many African countries. So what we're observing is a government policy intervention to rapidly increase access to secondary education in Tanzania in the early 2000s. Now, and the way we're thinking about this is that the MDG story, especially with regard to primary school enrollment, had a lot of international support in terms of funding for governments, technical assistance to help governments achieve UPE. But after the achievement of UPE, many governments were basically left on their own to think about secondary school enrollment. And so lo and behold, following the successes of the late 1990s, early 2000s, when you get to about 2005, many African countries had giant cohorts of graduates coming out of primary school and not having enough room in secondary schools. So they had to deal with the politics of that, this unmet demand for secondary education. And this all happened in a context of increasing electoral competition, so that even with UPE, despite being led or championed through this global compact in the MDGs, there were political dynamics at the local level in every country. So there were showing that countries were more likely to adopt UPE either right before or right after a national election. So incumbents or opposition politicians use this as a platform to champion specific policies. Now, because of the political dimension of the adoption of these policies, the types of investments mattered. So even with UPE, countries were more likely to abolish school fees or build new schools instead of going through the more expensive processes of curriculum reform and improving actual learning outcomes. So what you got was a lot of schooling without much learning involved, as Lant, Pritchett, and others like to put it. And this is because, building a school, abolishing fees is easily observable and attributable. And so for politicians, this is where the incentives lie. And the dynamics we observe here are actually not limited to education. So some of the findings in our paper are broadly applicable to other sectors, where governments adopt policies in anticipation of or in reaction to increased electoral competition. There have been work showing that agricultural policy in Malawi, infrastructure projects in Kenya, healthcare in Ghana, or social protection more broadly in Eastern and Southern Africa have been responsive to electoral competition and the incentives created by increased competition. And so what we're asking is, do programmatic policies win votes, right? So there's a lot of research out there that seems to say yes. And increasingly, there's also research that seems to say no, because you can imagine that, if you craft a policy that broadly impacts everyone, then the effect of the policy may be a wash, right? But if you target a policy through clientelistic means or as club goods, you may target it in a way that gives you comparative advantage as an incumbent. So this is still an open question. And what we do in this paper is answer it in a newish way than what exists in the literature. And so, the comparative literature so far seems to look at this mostly in a one-off fashion, whereby most scholars identify a policy and look at the electoral impact right after or right before the policy is implemented. And much of this literature has also not been in conversation with a much richer policy feedback literature which exists in the US and other advanced democracies. And the policy feedback literature is particularly interesting because it shows that, public opinion on specific policies may change over time. So for example, the Affordable Care Act may be popular in one electoral cycle, maybe toxic for the incumbent in a subsequent cycle, and then become popular again in a following cycle. So the changes in public opinion in response to a policy may actually impact the electoral impact of the policy. So why does all this matter? It matters because, if we think about politics as or electoral politics as a means of getting government to do what voters want and to respond to the incentives created by elections, we need to understand how these major policies structure political incentives, both in terms of voters and their preferences and the policy initiatives developed by politicians. Second, we think that visible government effectiveness is a core pillar of democracy. So, at CDDRL, of course, most of us, if I can put myself back in the camp, think a lot about democracy and how to strengthen democracy. And one takeaway from this paper is that, the strength of the democratic process is enhanced by having a visibly effective government because it provides voters with a means of evaluating incumbents and their performance while in office. And if we care about government effectiveness, then we should care about policy implementation and how it structures the political behavior of voters. All right, so what do? We look at Tanzania, and the key innovation in this paper is that instead of looking at one-off policy intervention, we look at the same policy over 3 elections. So the government in 2004 begins this process of rapidly expanding access to secondary schools by building thousands of secondary schools and quintupling enrollment. There's an election in 2005, another election in 2010, and then the last election we look at is in 2015. We hope to, as soon as we are able to get the data for the 2020 election, continue to look at the impact of this policy. So we look at the electoral impact of increasing access to secondary education over the 3 electoral cycles. Tanzania, as a country, is a hegemonic party state dominated by the Revolutionary Party, Chama cha Mapinduzi in Swahili. CCM has been in power forever, although its vote share has waxed and waned over multiple electoral cycles since the early 1990s, when Tanzania readopted multi-party democracy. It still dominates most of the electoral units that we look at. A feature of this policy that's interesting and which provides for great empirics from our perspective is the fact that the policy was implemented at the ward level, which is the lowest electoral unit. And so we're actually able to look at CCM vote share at the ward level. The way the policy was implemented is that the government promised to build a secondary school in every ward in Tanzania. And so you go from the vast majority of wards not having secondary schools to nearly all the wards in Tanzania having at least one secondary school within a very short period of time of about 6 years. So we see a lot of secondary school construction in a compressed period of time and in a programmatic fashion. The data doesn't show any sort of targeting of this policy, and I'll show you some evidence of that in a bit. So this was a broadly implemented attempt to increase access to secondary education in Tanzania. And so we look at the same policy over multiple electoral periods through a differences in differences approach. What we find is that the incumbent party had an electoral bump of about 2 percentage points in 2005. So after announcing the policy and before the implementation really ramps up, there's a 2 percentage point bump in CCM vote share at the ward level. 5 years hence, after the policy is implemented, CCM appears to suffer a 1.4 percentage point penalty in wards that were exposed to secondary school construction. And then by 2015, we don't see an observable effect of this policy. And the mechanism that we hypothesize is that we claim is driving these outcomes is that the implementation of the policy revealed information about costs and quality in ways that made voters sour on the government. Now, because of the nature of the data, we're not able to disentangle the particular facets of the broad-based sort of information bundle that we consider to be part of the mechanism. And I can talk more about that in the Q&A. All right, so how are we thinking about this? The core claim of the paper is that the process of policy implementation matters, and because of that, it matters because it reveals new information to voters about what the government is doing and whether the policy is beneficial, and any hidden costs that may exist as part of the policy. Now, most of existing works, especially on African countries, tend to view government action in terms of whether governments are implementing programmatic policies or clientelistic policies or engaging in patronage. We are claiming that in the Tanzanian context, this was not a clientelistic policy. This was actually programmatic policy whose parameters were revealed ex ante and even exposed. We see in the data that there was not much targeting, at least not in observable ways relative to CCM vote share at the local at the local level. Now, given our core claim, we're borrowing from the Americanist literature on policy feedback, I make the claim that new programmatic policies can actually recreate politics at the local level. This can happen because policies reveal new information during implementation, costs, benefits, competence of the government, and its ability to actually deliver on what was promised. Policies may actually activate new constituencies in the sense that if you create a benefit, those who benefit from the policy may be activated as a new constituency to either defend or ask for more of the same benefit. And the great work on Social Security in the US is a good example of this. And then finally, new policies may actually raise voters' expectations. And this is something that I have been thinking about when thinking about the phenomenon of democratic erosion and its implication for African countries, in the sense that often when we think about democratic erosion over the last 10 years, we seldom talk about the fact that the 90s and early 2000s really raised voters' expectations, and those expectations were not met. And that's perhaps why voters may be looking for alternatives. And big policies like this, if not done well, right, just widens that gap between expectations and actual experience. And so if we as part of creating an enabling environment for democratic and accountable government, I think democracy promotion should spend more time thinking about those involved in democracy promotion should spend more time thinking about how to reduce that gap by increasing government capacity to actually implement policies well, so that voters feel like the electoral process and the democratic process actually meets their expectations. These problems are accentuated in low-income states, where governments may not always have the fiscal capacity to do what they promise to do, and so there may be gaps between promises and actual implementation. Low-income states also tend to have a lot of announcement politics, which is the politicians' habit of announcing policy and then forcing bureaucrats to scramble to implement the policy. And this is what happened in Tanzania. So the government basically had a policy document that was very conservative in 2004, but ahead of the 2005 election, the prime minister at the time made this offhand promise that they were going to build secondary schools in every ward in Tanzania. And then the bureaucratic process then had to catch up to what the prime minister had promised. And if you don't have the bureaucratic capacity to do that, then policy implementation may suffer in ways that then influence how voters react to the actual policy. And then finally, many low-income countries only now beginning to implement these large-scale programmatic policies, right? And I think this is one sort of phenomenon that it's not yet fully appreciated in the comparative politics literature, perhaps outside of, especially by works in African countries, right? So we know about, the cash transfers in Latin America, or the work guarantees programs in South Asia. But many African countries are now experimenting with large-scale social protection, agricultural subsidies, and universal healthcare programs that are truly programmatic and therefore provide interesting opportunities for research, in part because they're new. And so government implementation will suffer from just questions of novelty, right? You're implementing a new project, the bureaucrats will not get it right, however good they may be in other domains. And so the bottom line here is that implementation matters, and therefore we should care about how governments implement policy for the technical reasons of efficient policy implementation, but also because of how the implementation process then structures how voters view the policy and the reaction to the same policy. So Tanzania. As I said, Tanzania is a hegemonic party system dominated by CCM, the successor to TANU. Tanzania had incredible success with the UPE in the early 2000s. Then that success with primary enrollment meant that there was demand for secondary enrollment. Tanzania had a more acute problem than most low-income countries because throughout the 70s and a bit of the 80s, the policy in Tanzania was to ration access to secondary education because of the incumbent party thought that they needed to train workers, and because there was no demand for high-skilled labor, primary education was sufficient. And so Tanzania enters the 2000s with only about 17% of primary school graduates being able to access secondary education. So it's a massive lift to do what they did over the same period, which is also why it was surprising to us to find a negative electoral impact by 2010, just because of the sheer amount of schools that were built during the period we studied. All right, and so the timeline here is that policies announced in 2004, made public ahead of the 2005 election, implementation begins in 2006. And we see a rapid increase in the total number of schools built and student enrollment. But that's also accompanied by declines in learning outcomes and implicit taxation of households, because the implementation process overshot what the government had planned. And so as part of the school construction effort, the government basically asked communities to build schools. And if you had built at least 4 classrooms, the government would provide roofing material and then deploy teachers and start funding the maintenance cost, even though local communities were still charged to raise extra cash to help maintain the schools. Now, families could either give cash, show up and provide the labor, or provide building material. There's a great piece of ethnography looking at a few districts in Tanzania, which shows how local officials were actually pretty strict on enforcing this informal taxation. They would literally sell people's furniture to raise money for the school construction effort. So on paper, the school construction effort was a big success, but the implementation process was not as smooth as the government had promised. And so the share of wards without secondary schools decreased from 83% in 2000 to less than 10% in 2015. So it's a massive school construction effort. And this is just to show you what happened. So I'm showing you total enrollment in both primary and secondary education. So as you can see, there's a big increase in primary enrollment in Tanzania in the post-independence period, a strong, a great increase with UPE. Secondary enrollment lagged. The relevant figure here is the proportion of primary graduates joining Form 1, which is the proportion of primary school graduates joining secondary education. Right, it goes from a low of just below 20% in the early 2000s to almost 70% more recently. So this was a big increase in access to secondary education. The total number of secondary schools also absolutely balloons during the time period of our study. So this was not sort of a low dose or microdosing in terms of policy implementation. This was a massive school construction effort in a compressed period of time. And most of the schools that we see in the data set are constructed in this time period here between 2005 and 2010, which is why we think that given just the empirical sort of volume of school construction effort that we have, looking at the difference between 2005 and the 2010 election gives us a sense of voters' actual reaction to school construction. Okay, so what we do basically is compare CCM vote share in wards that were exposed to school construction to those that were not. Wards are changing over time, but what we do is collapse all the wards to parent wards in 2000. And so we're looking at the same 2000 wards over time, even when they're divided up. And what we're doing is looking at vote share conditional on exposure to a school. And we complement this analysis with data from Afrobarometer and a national panel survey in Tanzania. We describe in the paper the sort of data efforts involved in finding out where schools were built, when they were built, matching them to wards, collapsing those wards to the 2000 parent wards, and then tracking them over time. Just to show you that, what we're looking at is an actual massive policy intervention. This is just school construction over time, the fraction of wards that are building a school across income levels. And as you can see, it's not the case that either high income or low income areas were the only ones building schools. Lots of wards were building a lot of schools during this time period, in orders of magnitude more than what happened before or after. So the big intervention happens between 2005 and 2010. Now, it's not the same for primary schools, right? So what we're picking up is not a primary school effect, because at this point, Tanzania is already saturated by primary schools because of the success of UPE in the early 2000s. We got survey data from the National Panel Survey, which asked Tanzanian households if they had contributed money to any community effort. And secondary school construction in the 2007-2008 survey is the leading sort of contribution by households. And these are not trivial sums. These are about some households contribute up to about half of their income as part of this taxation effort. All right, quickly before I show you the results here, it's important to note what happened with the school construction effort. So this dashed line is what the government had projected they would do, and this is what actually happened. So the government promised stated in their policy document that they would gradually increase access, but then actually overshot its own promise by rapidly increasing school construction through these locally coordinated efforts and succeeding a lot more than it had projected. But that success came at a cost, right? You see that in declines in the rating of government performance in the education sector, if you look at the Afrobarometer surveys. You also see that in declines in learning outcomes during this time period. And the declines in learning outcomes, we see it as part of the sort of signal that voters received during this time period. So let's pause and think through what actually happened. So in 2005, the school construction effort begins. The government succeeds way beyond its expectations. It quickly realizes that it doesn't have enough teachers. So at some point, it starts training high school graduates for 3 months and putting them in classrooms as teachers. The increased enrollment, as you can see here, means that students who may not have been as good as the ones who were already in school were now joining school. The cumulative effect of all of that is that learning outcomes plummeted. So the pass rate plummeted from highs of 80s to almost about 40% at its nadir in 2012. And then on top of that, parents found that the school construction effort actually came with a hidden tax, that they had to contribute to building these schools, and that local CCM officials and government bureaucrats at the ward level were actually willing to enforce this tax. So these combined, right, are the bundle of information that we see as producing the negative electoral effect come 2010, despite what an observer would see as a massive success, just looking at the sheer number of schools that are built and the total enrollment in secondary schools. This is just to show you the matching of wards, the effort that went into it. I promise you that it took a lot more hours to build this graphs, and so these maps. So I love them. This is just a quick sort of validation exercise that we did as part of our diff and diff effort to see if there's a parallel trend sort of pattern in wards that were exposed to schools and wards that were not exposed to school. And it more or less looks the same. I can talk more about the empirics in the Q&A if anyone is interested. So just to highlight our main findings, right? So we run a bunch of models, but the key findings here are that in the full sample, the school construction effort comes with a bump in 2005, a penalty in 2010, and no observable effect in 2015. There are interesting heterogeneous findings in the sense that places that already had schools actually punished the government more for its school construction effort. And we hypothesize that this is because if you already have a service, you have a calibration of assessing government performance. So if that service increases by getting an extra school of a lower quality, you have you have better information of assessing that decline in quality. While areas that did not have any schools had a lower penalty because the benefit of access perhaps outweighed the cost of reduction in quality or an increase in taxation as parents were forced to contribute to school construction. Okay, I have about a minute over, so let me conclude very quickly here. So what I've shown you is that the announcement plus school construction boosted CCM vote share in the 2005 election. We see a negative effect come 2012 because of this exposure to an implicit taxation and relatively lower quality schools. We don't see any discernible effects of the policy by 2015, and we see null effects of investments to improve learning outcomes. So in the paper, we have a small section trying to get at this question of did parents care about any improvements in learning outcomes? They do not. Consistent with the finding in the literature, we find that it's the visible and attributable actions by the government that are actually eliciting electoral responses, either as rewards or punishment. And so, this tells us very broadly that policy implementation matters, drive public opinion and vote choice. This is a call for us to who study low-income states and have over the past been looking at clientelistic politics and not programmatic politics. This is a call to start thinking a bit more seriously about policy feedback in this context, because the ability of the electoral process to create the right incentives for government performance will be dependent on government's ability to actually implement the policies that are demanded by citizens. Otherwise, governments will shy away from implementing policy that will be seen as failures and therefore elicit a backlash. And because of the cyclical or contingent nature of the response to programmatic policies, we call for the adoption in the comparative politics literature of a sort of policy feedback approach, and note that the same policy may be popular in one cycle and unpopular in the next. Because if we had done just a one-off study in 2005, we would have reported that the school construction effort actually had a positive effect. But what we see is that there's a positive effect, there's a backlash in the subsequent election, and then the effects peter out. And we plan to follow this same policy of at least the next 2 electoral cycles in subsequent studies to see whether it's sticky or not. Then to conclude, this project, I was telling Didi before we started, this project is part of a second book project, which looks at government, how government policy impacts voters in low income countries, with a focus on education policy in Tanzania, but also thinking about electoral accountability more broadly. So when we think about electoral politics, a lot of the action tends to be here. And I should say that this figure is from a World Bank development report, but I think nicely captures the dynamics at play here. We often think about elections, whether they're free or fair, candidates and whatnot. But often we forget that this is a core part of the process, right? For voters to be able to evaluate politicians, they need evidence of politicians' actions. And so having a handle on what politicians do and how well or poorly they do it is critical for making sense of this wider system. And so policy implementation is a core part of the democratic process. Strong, capable state strengthen the democratic process because they give voters reason to believe in the system and a means of evaluating politicians. I'll stop there and happy to answer questions.
Great, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, Ken. So I'll start by asking a question and then we'll go to Frank, who I'll unmute. But my question has to do with, I guess, the bottom half of this slide. So Phil Kiefer, also at the World Bank, has written about credible commitment problems with political parties that try to switch from clientelistic goods to programmatic promises. They obviously have credibility problems because of all of the policy implementation challenges and capacity problems that you've identified in your presentation. And the prediction is that when programmatic policies can't be credibly offered, that electoral competition will take place over clientelistic goods. So my question is, given that you've seen these cyclical effects of programmatic goods on the political party in Tanzania, do you think that that makes the opposition more likely to engage in clientelistic as opposed to programmatic promises? Or do you think it makes the party more inclined to rely on clientelism in the future?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think the Tanzanian context, because of the sheer hegemony of CCM, gives them cover so they can afford to fail and learn from the processes. But outside of Tanzania, you're absolutely right, right? So, most of the attempts that I've seen to end clientelistic politics tends to focus on behavior change on the part of voters or politicians, right? Forgetting what Kiefer rightly points out, that, you can have the most angelic politicians and voters, but if they can't credibly commit that I have a system that will deliver on education, then they're left with no choice but to engage in clientelistic politics. So I think to end clientelistic politics, those of us who care about ending it should think seriously about giving politicians and voters the tools to play this other kind of game. And I think strengthening states so that the promises of programmatic goods are credible is a good way to start.
Okay, I agree. So now I'm going to allow Frank to join us and ask a question.
So welcome back to CDDRL, Ken. I've been really enjoying following your Twitter feed. I recommend it to other people. So in a way, Didi kind of preempted part of my question. Again, it was about the difference between programmatic and clientelistic approaches, but do you see a real difference in the implementation? I mean, it seems to me implementation is important no matter what you're doing. And if you can't actually implement, you're going to set up, false expectations and everything you've talked about. But apart from just scale, are there differences in the ways in the implementation challenges between programmatic and clientelistic policies?
Yes. So the way I tend to conceptualize this is that one of the key differences, right? tends to be in the independence of these actors, right? So one of the clientelistic behavior that I see is basically politicians having their own private bureaucracies in their pockets. Either an NGO that they commandeer and use to do whatever they want at the local level, or bureaucrats who are engaging in open favoritism. Programmatic policies, tend to have this flavor of, yes, the scale is bigger, but there's also this sense that the bureaucrats implementing the policy are not in the pockets of an individual politician. Instead, they may be in the pocket, they could be in the pocket of the party, right, as opposed to an individual politician if it's a party state like CCM, or an approximation of that like CCM. But I get your overall point, right, that, at the limit, right, this distinction may not be as relevant, because one way to move from clientelism to programmatic policies at times may just mean scaling up what politicians are doing at the local level privately, or formalizing what politicians are doing at the local level privately. In my work on legislatures, I'm looking at constituency development funds in Kenya, which are trying to do this. MPs used to spend their own private money on development at the local level. They've now moved since 2003 to fund those processes through a government bureaucracy with the Constituency Development Fund, which is trying to take this away from being a personalist MP thing to a government project directed by the MP. And so there you see a more direct link between clientelism and the shift from personalized clientelism to more quasi-bureaucratic practice.
Okay. So we have a question from Karis Templeman, also at CDDRL, who asks about the mechanism. Do you have evidence from any of the election campaigns in 2005, 2010, or 2015 that schools were an issue that the CCM tried to use to claim credit? And did they try to run on school construction efforts? Did the opposition also capitalize either on failures of it or similar types of promises? And was there any variation between how the parties messaged the issue of education?
Yes. So in 2005, the prime minister at the time had presidential ambitions. In fact, he was supposed to succeed the incumbent. They fell out. He quit the party, ran as an opposition candidate in 2015. But part of his deal in promising these ward-level secondary schools was to build his brand as a provider of this massive programmatic policy, because he clearly saw the demand for secondary education. And so CCM runs in 2005 as the party that will expand secondary access. The opposition points out the failures in learning outcomes in 2010. This causes the government enough embarrassment that they invest heavily in trying to improve learning outcomes, and we see this shift. Although I should note that, as you'd expect, the shift happened because they changed how the exams were graded, so that it was a bit more, the failure rate was lower by construction. And it's not clear whether there was real improvements in learning outcomes. That's something that we're trying to figure out. So we're seeing the government both in terms of what is observable as part of campaign promises, signaling that education is a salient sector, but also responding at the bureaucratic level with the NECTA, the National Examination Agency, tweaking the national level exams to signal an improvement in learning outcomes during this time period.
Okay. So there's a question here from Eric Jensen, that says that budgets for capital intensive projects in developing countries sometimes don't take into account recurrent costs like building maintenance or teacher salaries. So your story of unanticipated costs of communities seems to fit that story and the arc of political benefits and also penalties in the longer run. Like the further you get away and deeper into the implementation process, the more likely you are to have these kinds of costs. Was that an issue that came up with any voters in your study?
Yeah. So the community level contribution effort, right, is I think although we're not able to completely disentangle the signal about school quality, the quality of teachers, the decline in learning outcomes, we think that the taxation was particularly salient because it meant that households had to raise money or show up or provide building materials. And then they also had to keep contributing for the ongoing maintenance of schools and construction of additional classrooms. And so, again, this speaks to this problem of the lack of fiscal capacity, basically short-circuiting what many hope to be the case of, programmatic policies eliciting positive feedback from voters and creating strong incentives for politicians to continue engaging in programmatic policies.
Okay. All right, I'm going to try to allow Leah Rosenzweig to speak and ask a question.
Great. Thanks, Didi. Thanks, Ken. Big fan of your work. Love this paper. I have 3 questions. You can sort of answer as many as you would like. So the first one is, you said you did not see much evidence of targeting of schools based on prior CCM vote share, but I'm curious if you saw any evidence of whether there was targeting due to turnout. So you could imagine that, if CCM feels very comfortable in their hold on the election, they might simply want to reward high turnout areas to motivate future voting. So I'm curious if you looked at that or see any evidence there. The second question would be, if you looked at national versus local level election results, maybe sort of data issues present problems for this, but I'm curious if citizens sort of reward or punish the president more or less than, say, MPs or ward councilors. And then third, I'm curious if your thoughts on sort of the null effect in 2015. Do you think it's sort of the dissipation of sort of this treatment that happened a much longer time ago? Or is it, more to do with the particular nature of the 2015 election? It was, the most competitive in Tanzania's history. Other policy issues were much more salient than education. So if you could comment on that. Thanks.
Yeah, so, I'll start with your last question. And great to have a Tanzanianist in the audience. One of the things that we'd hoped to find in 2015 is that because Lowassa was running, and Lowassa is the prime minister who initiates this whole process in 2005, who had quit the party and was now running as the opposition candidate, we expected that there would be some effect given how the ward schools were in some places even called the Lowassa ward schools, but we don't see any impact. So yeah, it could be that it's just the weirdness of the 2015 election, which is essentially an intra-CCM fight with a faction of CCM having defected to the opposition. Now, on your sort of ecological inference question, we're still looking into this to see if there was something happening at the MP level or at the presidential level. We started with the ward level because, broadly speaking, the CCM is overwhelmingly dominant in most of Tanzania, such that the ward level vote share tracks very closely with the MP and presidential vote shares. So, while we still need to finish matching wards to constituencies, we think that this broadly aligns. We're picking up a CCM effect as opposed to just a ward level effect, which would be different from an MP or presidential level effect. And then, on remind me again the first question, sorry.
Oh, sorry. It was just if you saw any targeting of schools based on turnout rather than
turnout.
Yeah.
Yeah, we haven't done that. And I will make a note to look into turnout as opposed to just vote share. Although, yeah, that would be interesting because most of the school construction is happening in rural areas, which are high turnout areas anyway. So, we may have a ceiling effect independent of, CCM vote share in those areas. But we can certainly look and see if there's any turnout effect. I'd have to think more about this because we're already collapsing wards back to 2000. So there may be turnout differentials between 2000 across the multiple cycles. and we'll think about how to disentangle that empirically.
Okay, so we have a question from Larry Diamond that sort of takes up one of Leah's questions. So at what point do the conditions around the election in 2020, particularly a decline in electoral integrity and competitiveness, render the logic or relevance of electoral accountability pretty meaningless, according to asks Larry?
Larry, could you clarify what you mean by meaningless?
He is not able to speak. Let me try something. All right, let's see if he wants to jump in.
So, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
My point is, if votes aren't counted fairly and opposition candidates are intimidated, arrested, and so on, and the regime knows it's going to win anyway, then to what extent, do you have this logic where voters are making judgments about policy, policy implementation is being held accountable? I understand that it doesn't require democracy, that incumbents lose elections in Kenya, at least legislative incumbents, and have been in some elections in Tanzania and elsewhere. But at some point, if you have complete electoral hegemony, it seems to me the logic that you are pursuing in this model kind of evaporates. And that's more a comment about the 2020 election, obviously, than 2015.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I fully agree with you, but on days when I'm feeling optimistic, right, I imagine that I'd rather be in a competitive, high capacity electoral authoritarian state than in a low capacity state that couldn't get anything done, right? And if we think about the process of democratic consolidation and political development more generally as a long slog, right? I think this is part of the building block of training voters and politicians about the issues that politics ought to be fought over, right? And through service provision, you raise expectations, right? So, I mean, a good example could be Vietnam. If and when Vietnam democratizes, right, the expectations among voters in Vietnam will be high in terms of schooling outcomes and other programmatic areas. Say compared to the Democratic Republic of Congo or other autocracies where service provision has not been part of the core repertoire that defines the social contract between the government and the governed. And so, even in a context like Tanzania with complete hegemony of CCM, I think this relationship still serves a purpose of, if nothing, right, training voters and forcing the government to fulfill its mandate as part of the existing social contract.
Okay, so I have a question from Brett Carter that is similar to this line of thought. Isn't this actually sort of an optimistic story about Tanzanian politics, that even in a dominant party regime, there's public pressure transmitted to the government to implement a policy, and the government has responded by improving it, even if the implementation was not perfect? So is this ultimately, in the long run, a story about government responsiveness? And I would just add, there's a book about segmented representation in the Latin American context, where parties learn to provide programmatic goods to some voters and clientelistic goods to other voters in order to secure winning coalitions. Is this a story ultimately of sort of moving in a programmatic direction and a more responsive direction?
Yes, yeah. So I mean, I think that would be consistent with the broad trends that we're seeing on the continent, right? As I said at the outset, I think a few countries in Africa, especially those that have regularized electoral competition, have slowly begun moving in this direction of feeling public pressure to do one big thing each electoral cycle, whether it's ag policy, healthcare, education, infrastructure, right? And the interesting thing is that, once voters learn this, right, it's hard to unlearn, and it ratchets up expectations so that each new administration will be met with an expectation that it'll also do something bigger. So, Ghana, Uganda, Kenya have gone through their own universal secondary education cycles, right, which was informed, like in Tanzania, with the UPE success that created massive demand for secondary education. And politicians simply could not ignore it. So yeah, I agree that this, for some countries at least, there seems to be this ratcheting up effect of voter expectations, which obviously raises important questions about the capacity to live on those promises. And I think creates a real danger, right, for democratic erosion when we think about that gap, because from my own work on legislatures, right, I think electoral turnover in many African countries is way too high at the legislative level, right? More than 60% of members don't make it back. There's virtually no institutional memory. It's destructive to the political process. And so strengthening the capacity to deliver may lower the turnover rate enough to begin to strengthen institutions. But it's hard to do that if voters perpetually they perpetually feel like politicians simply do not meet their expectations. And then many just assume that they're corrupt or not exerting effort, as opposed to they can't call the bureaucrat to make sure that the local clinic is stocked because there's no capacity to do that.
All right, well then I'll group questions here at the end. And for the final question, just ask, do you have examples from some of the countries you just listed that did implement universal secondary education of, over time, an improvement to the secondary education process? Were there any places that were able to successfully keep secondary school enrollment high and improve education over time, which is obviously a much bigger ask than simply building schools, as you noted?
Yeah, I would say that I don't know about improvement. I'd say with minimal erosion of quality. Ghana probably gets close. I think Kenya almost broke its own system by increasing access. Right, Uganda is struggling with increased access. Tanzania similarly, and this is a challenge of schools everywhere, right? The quality of schooling is not easily observable and attributable. Parents, when their kids do well, think that they're smart, or their kids are smart, or it's their effort, right? Politicians don't want to think about all what goes into the production function of producing A's in the classroom. Too many steps. It's easier to build a school and cut a ribbon or abolish fees. And the nature of the political process is that those are the incentives that are created by the political process, right? The visible and attributable features of the education system. And so that's what politicians typically invest in when they're expanding access, building more schools, abolishing fees, as opposed to thinking about curriculum development, teaching to students to learn, the parental involvement to parent-teacher committees that could improve learning outcomes. That's just too much, right? It's easy to do the one-off thing, which is why I think again, I'm happy to see that there's increasingly a lot of research on bureaucracies in low-income states. Hopefully, we can bring that sort of research agenda back in thinking about how to strengthen states as a means of making sure that this sort of system of accountability and service provision works well in the subset of countries that seem to be moving in the right direction, at least normatively speaking.
Okay, great. Well, I'm very excited for this book project. It was very nice to see you again and commiserate about second book woes, but this project is great. And we were very excited to see this research. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and hope everybody has a good day. Thanks, Ken.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And yeah, hopefully we'll be back in person soon.
Yes, all right, thanks.